Do you ever dread that journal review request hitting your inbox, worried that you'll either spend way too long on it or worse, become reviewer 2 in the process? Hey, co-authors. In this episode, we're talking about how to review other people's work without becoming reviewer 2, the condescending, nitpicky, or ego-driven villain we've all encountered and, if we're honest, sometimes have accidentally on purpose been. You'll learn how bad reviewers erode the culture of scholarship and discourage innovation and how to avoid falling into those traps yourself. So let's dive in. Folks, I've got a confession to make. I have been reviewer 2. I was a first-year doctoral student, and an editor reached out to me to review a piece, and I had no idea what it meant to be a reviewer, or even really enough content knowledge to be a good reviewer for someone. But of course I said yes, because you're a doc student, and I want to impress the editor, and I want to show how smart I am, and I want to do all the things. So I said yes. And this person had a paper on universal design of learning, which I had never heard of before because that was not really my background at the time. And so I had written in my critique, you have this framework called universal design of learning. I'm very suspicious of anything that purports to be universal because frameworks that have that sort of claim are usually ones that exclude people. If you know anything about universal design for learning, like that's the whole point of the framework, right? Is that it's supposed to be addressing people at the margins. It's supposed to be addressing all learners by trying to find ways of constructing pedagogical materials, classroom instruction, everything that goes on in the classroom in such a way as to address all learners, and specifically to address how traditional pedagogy leaves people out. And so I ended up saying that the piece should be rejected, and thankfully the editor did not do that. And they instead did not ask me to review the piece again. I found out later that that piece had been published in the journal, and I felt like a real idiot. But this is the problem that we face, right? Is that oftentimes we are not given very clear instructions about what it means to be a good reviewer. There's not a lot of mentorship around this. A lot of young scholars learn how to review other people's work primarily by simply emulating whatever their instructors or advisors are doing for them or were doing for them whenever they were in their programs. They might be learning from reviews that they're getting from journals. Well, that's a really hit or miss process, right? You might be getting very good reviews from folks and you might try to emulate those things. You might get some that were like my review whenever I was younger and stupid and didn't know what I was doing. As a result, like you might learn some very bad habits. And so that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about how to review other people's work without being a reviewer 2. So let's dive in. Are you interested in mastering scholarly writing, developing productivity, and increasing impact, all while staying healthy? Then welcome to the Publishing Academic Research Podcast. My name is Dr. Kyle Ruddick, and I'm a full professor and writing coach who's dedicated to making sure you break through whatever is stopping you from reaching your scholarly goals. I meet so many scholars who have creative, innovative, and daring ideas, but can never seem to get those projects from proposals to print. I want you to get your work in the hands of people who will read it and appreciate it. So let's get into this week's big idea. So before I get into the problems that I typically see with reviewers, I do want to point out that this is not just a problem that I find with early career scholars. Even mid and late career scholars do a simply terrible job of reviewing other people's work. And this goes back to what I was saying before. A lot of it is bad mentoring or a lack of mentoring that happens from the instructors and advisors that we had. We've had bad experiences ourselves, so we pick up bad habits. Our journal editors are usually not doing any type of instruction around this about what it is that they want to see. And so as a result, people just don't know what they're doing. And there's a lot of implicit frameworks that are being deployed whenever people are reviewing other people's work. Sometimes I see reviewers that are looking primarily for grammar, editing, syntax, and really kind of focusing on that micro level of writing style. I see other people just give really broad comments no matter what the quality of the writing is. They don't really engage with the arguments of the text. They don't really engage with the findings or anything. They're just like, oh yeah, this looks pretty good, or oh yeah, this doesn't look good to me. And then some people, like it's just a full-blown marathon. Everything is done from line editing to thematic feedback and everything in between. People are just all over the place on this. And so before we even start to think about what are good practices of giving reviewer feedback, I'd like to spend some time on just identifying what I think of as sort of the 3 archetypes of bad reviewers that I oftentimes see as an editor or as an author whenever I'm getting feedback from reviewers. The first one, and probably the one that I hate the most is what I call the mirror trap, which is whenever I get a reviewer who review your work through the prism of their own research. And so everything that you do is, well, would this person have made that methodological choice? Would they have deployed this particular theory or framework? Would they have interpreted the results this way? And if you don't do things exactly the way the reviewer would have done them, then you are told that you've done it wrong. Well, that could be the case if you don't know what you're doing and you made a bad choice. But reviewers who fall into the mirror trap, it's not because you've done something wrong that elicits this response from them. Instead, it is a preference or a choice that they would have made that you would not have made. And so this oftentimes leads to feedback like, the author should have been citing these people. And it just so happens that the people that you should be citing are this reviewer or closely associated authors that this reviewer is reading and pulls on all the time. I recently had a piece that was so egregiously bad about this because the reviewer said, I've been doing work in this field for X amount of years. And the fact that I, the author, has not cited their work, it feels like a slap in the face. It's like, okay, few things there. A, maybe don't take things so personally, right? Just because someone didn't cite you does not mean that that's the negation of your existence as a scholar or as a person. There's no reason to be like that. I don't care how important you are. There's probably different ways that you can address the same topic, and you don't own any topic. But B, and what was the funniest part about it is that this person says, you should be citing me, but I don't know who the person is, right? Like it's an anonymous review. And of course they can't say that and then give me examples of their own work that I should be citing, because if I did that, then I would know who my reviewer was. So now I'm left with an impossible expectation. I'm supposed to divine who this person is, what pieces of scholarship that they've published that I'm not reading that I should read, and then incorporate it all without knowing who they are. That's stupid. That is a bad reviewer. Either this person has a clear argument for how their work should and could be cited in this piece, and they can direct me to that anonymously by not claiming it as their own work, or their ego can take a step back. Like either one of those is fine options, but what is not fair is being personally indignant that your work is not being cited. The second type of problematic reviewer is what I would consider to be the gatekeeper mentality reviewer. And so unlike the first type where a reviewer might say everything needs to be cited and it needs to reflect back on me, this person really kind of sees themselves as more of a protector of a disciplinary purity or a particular sort of lineage or tradition within that field of study. It's not necessarily that they want their work to be cited, but they want to see certain types of citational practices and certain types of methodological choices being made because that's what they're comfortable with. You might see this whenever a scholar starts to deploy new methodological or an analytical approaches to data that haven't been seen in that field before. So for example, in my field, we have a couple of scholars who they're like, I don't know how else to say it. They're like huge stats nerds, man. Like they're just huge nerds. I love them for it, but that's what they are. They go to stats camps over the summer. They learn all of these really sophisticated, awesome ways of treating and analyzing data. And that's great, except now like 95% of the other people in my discipline don't know what to do with their work because they don't have the requisite training now to properly evaluate that work. And so what's a lot of people's response to that? Well, I see this new analysis. This person's making this argument for how it's better than the way that we've been doing things before. Well, that makes me feel away, right? That makes me feel kind of bad. Makes me feel a little bit stupid and small because I haven't been able to keep up with this methodological rigor and I don't really know how to do this. And so it must not be good. That's the thing. I don't understand it, so it must not be good. This sort of overemphasis on a particular approach to orthodoxy then really starts to stifle innovation. It sort of shuts down conversations because anytime that new theories or new methods or anything else gets introduced to the field, there is a group of scholars who are mind guarding that particular outlet or even that entire field and making sure that, this sort of gatekeeper mentality, this groupthink sort of approach to things shuts down any sort of new innovation. The last thing that I see, and this is probably the most common, certainly it was the case about me in the opening story, and I think it's particularly true for doc students and other early career scholars, which is to say the third type of problematic reviewer are those that overcompensate through critique. This type of reviewer may not fully understand what the piece is or what it's trying to do. They may not like its framework. They may not like its implications or findings, but whatever it is that they don't like about it, instead of coming at that from a place of, this is something I can learn because this is something that the reviewer doesn't know, or this is something that I can mentor the authors about, because in the case that there is actually something wrong and the reviewer notices that and should be intervening. Instead, it's this sort of self-designation that I'm going to make this person feel bad and be overly critical and overly hostile as a way of shutting this person down and making them feel small for the type of work that they've done here. And oftentimes it's this mistake that they believe that being harsh signals like their rigor, and that this ability to point out other people's mistakes is an indicator of their own intelligence. And so they're kind of a jerk whenever they give you your feedback, the person who kind of makes it their point in life just to make other people feel small. They see their contribution as being a reviewer that is overly negative and doesn't let things go through as a way of sort of bolstering their own self and their own ego. Overall, what I think is really problematic about these different types of reviewers is that on an individual level, they discourage people. They make this process that is an incredibly identity-threatening practice anyway, taking our work, submitting that to anonymous reviewers, and seeing if it is publishable, that other people can use, and that makes it actionable, right? Like, that's already an incredibly identity-threatening proposition. But then you have these different types of reviewers that are all about mirroring themselves, that are gatekeepers, that are overly critical, and it just makes this practice even more intolerable and toxic. But not even just for the individual. If you think about this in terms of your discipline, that every time that a person that has a good idea, if they're encountering this type of reviewer, they may not ever try to publish again. Or if they do publish, maybe they publish in a lesser journal that's not as well read. All that leads to is a culture where we stifle innovation and we discourage risk-taking, because anytime that we try to do anything that doesn't cater to the tastes of these problematic reviewers, our work doesn't get out. So these reviewers then are having an incredibly regressive effect on our discipline and on the advancement of scholarship. And so we want to make sure that we are not being like that too. And so what I want to talk about now then is, what does good reviewing look like then? And what are some ways that we can provide people good feedback while also not burning ourselves out? So before I get into some specific things that you should be thinking about in terms of reviewing, I just want to say that it's important for us to remember that every submission, every time that you're reading other people's work, that is someone's effort and hope, and we need to respect that. No matter how bad it is, no matter how frustrated we might be with the prose, no matter how confused we are by the choices that are made, no matter what's going on in the piece, there is no sense in us becoming personally affronted whenever things don't meet our expectations, and instead recognizing that everyone is on their journey into being a published author, and that one of the things that we can do is to make sure that we are paying it forward and doing good work by helping other people along the way. If something is so bad that it does not merit your review, then you should not accept to review it, and you should email the editor and say, look, you've invited me to review this. I do not feel like this piece rises to the level of quality for me to review, and so I'm going to decline to review it. If you do that too many times, then you might be asked to leave the editorial review board because you're not reviewing pieces for the journal. If that's the case, then that means that either you have a bad editor, they keep sending out things to you that you should not be reviewing and that they should be desk rejecting, or that means that you are a bad reviewer and that you have unrealistic expectations for how people's work should be whenever it is submitted, in which case you need to recalibrate yourself and your expectations before you start reviewing people's work, because there's absolutely no defense for being snarky, snippy, or otherwise a jerk in a review. If it's that bad, then you should not have agreed to review it in the first place. So that being said, what are some things that you can do to make sure that you are being a good reviewer? First off, I would say it's important for us to recognize what kind of feedback people might need where they are in their process. As an editor, I find that reviewers are the most persnickety with authors whenever a reviewer typically gives micro level commentary back. So they do a lot of sentence level edits, a lot of track changes, comments, or otherwise give a lot of very detailed, specific line by line feedback. But the piece is not in a place that warrants that level of feedback yet. And so in that case, the reviewer gets very upset and gets very frustrated because they're having to give so much feedback back because it feels like every sentence, every paragraph, every page is just dripping with comments and corrections and edits and all sorts of things. If you find yourself giving this level of feedback back to an author, then you're not reviewing correctly. You should not be giving that much feedback to someone if they have broad problems with their manuscript that need to be addressed before that level of micro commentary is worthwhile. So the first thing that you need to think to yourself is, what level of feedback does this person need? Do they need broad strokes feedback? So for example, I oftentimes see work from early career scholars that uses 2, 3, 4 different theoretical frameworks. And it is incredibly rare that a piece requires multiple theoretical frameworks in order for its analysis to work, and even more rare that an early career scholar has the command of the literature to the point to where they can deploy multiple frameworks and they all fit neatly together. So that being the case, whenever I see something that has multiple frameworks, I will read through the results, and then my feedback back to that author might be, hey, look, you've got 2, 3, 4 different types of theories that are working in your literature review. After looking at your findings, I feel like this one of your frameworks is good enough to encapsulate all of the data. You don't need these other 2, 3, 4 frameworks. You just need this one. Here's the one that I think that you should use. Here's why I think you should use it. Here's some citations that help you along the way. Here's some ideas of how that might shape some of your findings. Go with God, submit somewhere else, but hopefully this is helpful for you to get this published. There's no sense in trying to help them work through all of their data, to point out every methodological choice, to go through all of their literature. At this point, this broad set of feedback is all that's necessary. That's going to take me maybe an hour to do. And if I do that for an hour, I'm not going to feel frustrated and drained to give that type of feedback, and I can go on and do other things afterwards. In other times, if I feel like something is really close but needs a whole lot of work to get there, I will take the time to do that, and I can give that more micro level commentary. And that might take me 2 or even 3 hours to give all that feedback. But that's me making a choice to spend that type of time because I see potential in a piece and I want to help it get to that next level. I don't have to give that with every single thing that comes across my desk. If I did that, I wouldn't have time for anything else. So making sure that you know where your reviewer energy is going is really, really important. The second thing that's really important for you to do is to provide citations for your feedback and for anything that you think that the author should be citing. I can't tell you how many times as an author or as an editor, I've seen reviewer comments and it's like, you should be citing more work in X theory, or you should be citing more work in this thing or that thing. And it's like, okay, but what pieces? And you don't have to do their homework for them. But at the same time, if you think that this framework is the thing that they should be using, if you think that this body of literature is something that they need to have and it's just not present in the article, then they don't know it exists. So why are you asking them to take a revise and resubmit decision possibly, and then go hide in a cave for 30 days and try to divine what it is that you wanted, what specific pieces are supposed to be cited, how those pieces are supposed to look in their piece? Like, that's stupid. Like, you know what you want to see. You should just tell a person what it is that you want to see. Now, they are free to tell you, take a long walk off short pier, right? Like, they can tell you that they're not going to do that. That's the magic of this process, is that authors don't have to do what you tell them to. You're a reviewer. Your feedback is just feedback. It's suggestions. It's not a commandment. But if you are going to give someone suggestions, you should be able to point them in the direction of the correct citations that you think are going to help them. And if you think that they've done something wrong in their analysis, or they've gotten something wrong in a particular theory or whatever it might be, then again, it's important for you to say, I think you're wrong because, and then quote or paraphrase from whatever source it is that you think backs up your claim, and then cite that for the author. Again, it's incredibly frustrating whenever someone says something like, research would contradict this. What research? Whose research? Anyone, PhD or not, can say, the research says. That's not hard at all. So for you as a scholar to deploy that is indefensible unless you show what the research is. It is your job as the reviewer to provide citational evidence as to why you disagree with that person. If you're not able or willing to do that, then you shouldn't be disagreeing with the author because they have their own citational evidence. And so you have to offer your own in order for you to be taken seriously and credibly. The third thing to think about is just tone check. You have to think to yourself, the person who reads this, especially if your decision is going to be one for reject or major revise and resubmit, but it's not acceptance. It's not super supportive of the work. Any decision that's going to look like that, they are going to read your feedback in the worst possible light. Everything that you say is going to be scrutinized, picked apart, evaluated, and reevaluated. I received a decision for a revise and resubmit from a journal one time early in my career, and it said something like, "Thank you for your submission. With extensive revisions, your work may rise to the level of being published in this journal." And I was like, well, that's kind of a backhanded jerk way of saying you've got to revise and resubmit, especially for early career scholars. This might be one of the first times, if not the first time, that they put themselves out there, that they put their work on the line, and that if you write a snarky, snippy email back to them, that's going to make them feel bad. And that's not what this process is about. This process is about making sure that the best knowledge gets published. It's not about dunking on other people. And so instead of saying things like, you don't have this in your paper, you could say, consider expanding on this point. Or instead of saying, this was a poor methodological choice, you could say something like, current literature in the field has deployed this type of methodological approach. Again, you don't have to sit there and make people feel bad to get your point across. What I oftentimes do is I will go through, I will review a piece, and then I will wait for a day or maybe even two. And then I revisit the things that I've written before I send those to the editor. And the reason that I do that is simple. I might get really deep into a review process. I might find myself getting increasingly frustrated with someone. And as a result, as the piece wears on, my comments get snippier and snippier. Well, that's not helpful. So taking a little bit of time, taking a step back, and then going back and reframing the feedback to be more invitational. Overall, I think what's important to remember is two things. A, even though reviewers like to think that what they submit has this gatekeeping function, the reality of the situation is that it is editors who make decisions about whether to accept or reject pieces for a journal. You might submit feedback that is a reject, and the editor says to revise and resubmit, or even to accept it, or vice versa. So there's very little reason for you as a reviewer to feel this sense of superiority and power, because at the end of the day, you don't have any. Your feedback informs the editor's decision, and it might provide clarification for why that decision has been made, and it should provide feedback as to how an author's work might improve. But it itself holds very little power. And so taking a step back and thinking to ourselves, how can we be the most helpful to others in this space is, I think, a much better ethic than, will I allow this to be published in my journal? Because none of us own these spaces. We are caretakers of this knowledge for a short amount of time, and we should be instead trying to help other people be a part of these conversations rather than exclude them from it. I will also say, if you are an editor and you consistently see a reviewer engaging in these bad reviewer practices, and for the love of God, stop asking them to review. I don't care how smart a person is. You can give feedback back to a person without being a jerk. And if a reviewer does give that feedback and you've counseled them on the type of feedback that they're getting and that it's not appropriate and they continue to engage in that, throw them off the review board. Being on an editorial review board is a privilege. It's not a right. The other thing that I will say is that in order for you to be a good reviewer, it's important for you to pace yourself and to not burn yourself out. What I typically say is that I will review 2 pieces for a journal for every 1 piece in that journal that I publish per year. Now, you might want to do more than that, but you should not be doing less than that. It is incredibly frustrating as an editor whenever I see authors publish multiple times in the same outlet, and then whenever they're asked to review, they're too busy to review. No, you're not too busy. You're just too selfish. I realize that it's better for you and your career for you to publish a piece than it is for you to review a piece. And yet, good scholarship in science does not proceed by any one person. It proceeds with the collective effort of a community of scholars. And so if you are not contributing to that community of scholars, then that's a problem. You should protect yourself. You do not want to get taken advantage of. You should not be reviewing dozens of articles. And I think that as AI has made things a lot easier, not just in terms of just AI slop, like just AI generating whole articles out of nothing, which is a problem and is making it incredibly difficult for journals to proceed forward, but even in good ways, like international scholars who English is perhaps not their first language. And so just having the AI help with that in order for them to have access to English-based journals that they may not have had in the past. There's just a lot more work being submitted than there was in the past. And so it's very easy to find yourself always getting tied up with reviews. But I think that as long as you have clear expectations with the editor that you are not going to be doing more than 2, maybe 3 reviews for a journal for every one piece that you publish, then I think that that is perfectly acceptable. And I think that you will find that you are able to balance the best part of reviewing, which is you get to read cutting edge literature, you get to see how conversations in your field are proceeding, and especially if you're early career, you kind of get to see what the bar is for what meets the expectations for publication in that particular outlet. And those are all things that you wouldn't get a chance to see absent the review process. And so the review process can be about getting knowledge and getting an inside kind of look at your field. And it doesn't have to be conceived of solely as it's me giving service to my field. You can get stuff out of it if you are doing it correctly. And so keeping that in mind, I think, is a very healthy way to approach reviewing, especially if you are doing it in a way that is consistent with your level of involvement in that scholarly community and the types of submissions that you're making to that journal or those types of outlets. Okay, so that's going to about wrap it up for me, folks. As always, I'm interested in the stuff that you all are doing. So if there are habits, tips, tricks, rituals, things that you're doing to help you whenever you're reviewing other people's work, or if you've experienced things that are particularly bad from reviewers and you want to let me know, drop me a line. You can find me on LinkedIn. My contact information is in the description. I love learning about that stuff. I can pass that on to my own clients, my own students. And also, I'm happy to give you a shout out whenever I talk about this again on the podcast. At this point, I still have a couple of slots open for coaching. So if you're wanting someone who can help you stay on task, help you manage your energy, develop your writing, and generally be a resource for you, I'm happy to do that with you. You can have a free 30-minute consultation with me. I'd love to meet with you, talk with you, learn about the stuff that you're doing, because it really it brings me joy to know the type of work that's going on out there and to be a part of other people's success. So thank you again for listening, and I will see you in next week's episode. Hey, co-authors, what's stopping your best ideas from becoming your next big publication? Brilliant research shouldn't die in your drafts folder. Now's the time to bridge the gap between the possible and the published. You can support this podcast by subscribing to it, leaving a positive review, assigning it to your classes, or sharing it with a colleague. Let me know what I can do to make this the best podcast resource for you. And if you'd like to know more about my writing coach services, then you can find my information in the podcast description and set up an appointment. I'll be back next week with another episode. But until then, keep healthy, keep writing, and don't let reviewer 2 get you down.